What happens when the world's most elite warriors meet someone who makes them look like amateurs? In a world where Navy SEALs represent the pinnacle of military training and combat expertise, there exists a shadow that even these legends fear to cross. This is the story of Maya Chen, a woman whose quiet exterior masks skills that would redefine what it means to be dangerous. On a cold Tuesday evening in downtown Seattle, 3 men made a decision that would change everything they thought they knew about power, training, and survival. They thought they had found an easy target, a small Asian woman walking alone through a dimly lit parking garage. What they didn't know was that they had just chosen to hunt the most lethal predator any of them would ever encounter. This isn't a story about luck or coincidence. This is about what happens when years of the most intense training imaginable meets real-world violence, and how sometimes the most unassuming person in the room is the one you should fear the most. Maya Chen didn't look for trouble that night, but when trouble found her, it learned a lesson it would never forget. Maya Chen pulled her Honda Civic into the underground parking garage of the Meridian office complex at exactly 11:47 p.m. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting dancing shadows between the concrete pillars that supported the building above. She had stayed late again at her consulting firm, working on a project that demanded perfection. At 28 years old, Maya had built a reputation for being meticulous, quiet, and incredibly reliable. Her colleagues saw her as the woman who never raised her voice, never caused drama, and always delivered results ahead of schedule. What they didn't see was the way she moved through the world with a subtle awareness that came from years of training most people couldn't imagine. Maya's steps were measured and purposeful as she walked toward the elevator, her senses automatically cataloging every sound, every movement, every potential threat in her environment. The parking garage was mostly empty at this hour, with only a dozen cars scattered across the vast concrete expanse. 3 levels above, in the building's security office, Marcus Williams adjusted his headset and leaned back in his chair. At 32, Marcus was a former Navy SEAL who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before transitioning to civilian security work. The night shift at Meridian paid well, and it was usually quiet enough for him to catch up on online courses he was taking toward his business degree. His military training had taught him to stay alert even during routine assignments, but after 6 months of watching empty hallways and parking garages, he had settled into a comfortable rhythm. Marcus glanced at the bank of monitors displaying feeds from cameras throughout the building. Most showed empty corridors and vacant offices, but one caught his attention. A small Asian woman was walking across the parking garage, heading toward the elevators. He watched her move with an economy of motion that seemed unusual, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. There was something about the way she carried herself that reminded him of his old teammates, but he dismissed the thought as ridiculous. 2 blocks away, Jake Morrison and Tommy Valdez sat in Jake's pickup truck, sharing a bottle of whiskey and nursing their anger. Both men were in their early 30s and had recently been discharged from the Navy SEALs under circumstances they preferred not to discuss. The transition to civilian life had been harder than either had expected, and tonight's drinking session had devolved into bitter complaints about how the world didn't appreciate their service or recognize their skills. Jake took another pull from the bottle and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. At 6'2", with the build of someone who had spent years maintaining peak physical condition, he still looked every inch the elite soldier he had once been. His discharge papers cited conduct unbecoming, but Jake preferred to think of it as a personality conflict with commanding officers who didn't understand what it took to get the job done. Tommy was shorter but more compact, with the kind of wiry strength that came from years of specialized training. His discharge had been even messier than Jake's, involving an incident during shore leave that had required the intervention of both military police and local authorities. Neither man talked about the specifics of what had ended their careers, but both carried the same sense of entitlement and barely controlled aggression that had gotten them into trouble in the first place. The conversation had turned to money, as it often did these days. Both men were struggling to find work that paid enough to maintain the lifestyle they felt they deserved. Their military skills seemed to have little value in the civilian world, and the respect they had grown accustomed to had evaporated the moment they took off the uniform. "You know what our problem is?" Jake said, his words slightly slurred from the alcohol. "We're thinking too small. All these security jobs and bouncer gigs, they're paying us like we're regular people." "But we're not regular people, Tommy. We're SEALs." Tommy nodded, though something in his friend's tone made him uneasy. They had been having variations of this conversation for months, and lately, Jake's suggestions had been getting more extreme. Tonight felt different, though. There was an edge to Jake's voice that Tommy recognized from their military days, the sound of someone who was about to cross a line. "What are you thinking?" Tommy asked, though part of him didn't want to know the answer. Jake gestured toward the office buildings that lined the street. Look at all these places. Fancy cars, expensive clothes, people who've never had to fight for anything in their lives. They walk around like they own the world, but what would they do if someone like us decided to take what we wanted? The suggestion hung in the air between them, unspoken but clearly understood. Tommy felt his stomach clench. This was exactly the kind of thinking that had gotten them both discharged, and he knew that following Jake down this path would only lead to more trouble. But the whiskey and his own frustration made it hard to think clearly, and Jake's confidence was infectious. Back in the parking garage, Maya reached her car and began searching through her purse for her keys. The simple action was performed with the same careful awareness that characterized everything she did. Her fingers found the keys immediately. She had trained herself never to fumble or search frantically for anything, but she took an extra moment to scan her surroundings before unlocking the door. The garage was quiet except for the hum of ventilation systems and the distant sound of traffic from the street above. Maya's training had taught her to trust her instincts, and something about the environment felt slightly off. It wasn't anything she could identify specifically, just a subtle shift in the energy of the space that made her pause. Maya had learned to pay attention to these feelings during her years of training with her mentor, Dr. Elizabeth Hayes. Dr. Hayes had been a legend in certain circles, a former Army intelligence officer who had developed training programs for elite units before retiring to run a private security consulting firm. Maya had been Dr. Hayes' final and most promising student, though their relationship had been kept strictly confidential for reasons that would become clear only years later. The training had been unlike anything the military offered its own personnel. Dr. Hayes believed that true combat effectiveness came not from aggression or physical strength, but from perfect situational awareness, absolute precision, and the ability to end threats with minimal effort. Maya had spent 5 years learning techniques that combined elements of martial arts, tactical thinking, and psychological warfare in ways that made traditional combat training seem almost primitive by comparison. Standing in the parking garage, Maya felt the familiar heightening of her senses that came when her training kicked in. Colors seemed sharper, sounds became more distinct, and time seemed to slow slightly as her mind processed potential threats and responses. She had hoped never to need these skills in the real world, but Dr. Hayes had made it clear that the training was not theoretical. Jake started the engine of his pickup truck and pulled out into traffic. The whiskey had made the decision for him, and Tommy's failure to object had been taken as agreement. They would find someone vulnerable, someone who looked like they had money, and they would take what they wanted. It was time to stop being victims and start taking control. The truck moved through the late-night streets, with Jake's eyes scanning for opportunities. He was looking for someone alone, someone who wouldn't be able to fight back, someone who would understand that resistance would only make things worse. After 20 minutes of driving, he spotted the perfect target. A small Asian woman was getting into her car in an underground parking garage. She was well-dressed, probably had cash and credit cards, and was completely isolated from any help. Jake smiled and pulled into the garage, parking near the entrance where they could make a quick escape if necessary. Marcus Williams noticed the pickup truck on his monitors the moment it entered the parking garage. 2 men got out and began walking purposefully toward the woman he had been watching earlier. Something about their body language immediately put him on alert. These weren't random pedestrians or lost visitors. They were moving with the focused intent of predators who had found their prey. Marcus reached for his radio to call for backup, but hesitated. The men hadn't actually done anything yet, and he couldn't be sure of their intentions. His military training told him to trust his instincts, but his civilian job required him to follow protocols and avoid false alarms. He decided to continue watching while keeping his finger near the emergency button. Maya was opening her car door when she heard the footsteps approaching from behind. 2 sets of boots on concrete, moving with military precision but trying to appear casual. Her body tensed automatically as her training assessed the threat level and began calculating responses. She could see the men's reflection in her car window, both large, both moving with the controlled aggression of people who were accustomed to using violence to solve problems. Jake and Tommy approached from different angles, a basic tactical formation designed to prevent their target from escaping in any direction. Jake had his hand resting on a knife concealed in his jacket pocket, while Tommy carried a small weighted sap that would be effective for controlling someone without causing permanent damage. They had done this kind of thing before, though never as civilians and never for personal gain. "Excuse me, ma'am," Jake called out when they were about 10 feet away. His voice was friendly and casual, the tone of someone asking for directions or the time. Maya recognized it immediately as a predator's technique, appear harmless until the moment of attack. Maya turned slowly to face the approaching men, her movements deliberate and controlled. To Jake and Tommy, she looked exactly like what they expected, a small, frightened woman who was about to become their victim. They saw her expensive clothes, her nice car, and her isolated position, and they assumed they had found easy prey. What they couldn't see was the way Maya's mind was processing their approach angles, their body language, their weapon placement, and the dozen different ways she could neutralize both of them before they realized what was happening. Dr. Hayes had taught her that the most dangerous opponents were often the ones who looked least threatening, and Maya had taken that lesson to heart. Jake smiled as he got closer. The expression predatory and confident. Tommy hung back slightly, ready to cut off any escape route Maya might try to use. Neither man had any doubt about how the next few minutes would unfold. They had the training, the experience, and the physical advantage. What could possibly go wrong? In the security office 3 floors above, Marcus Williams made his decision and reached for the emergency button. His instincts were screaming that something bad was about to happen, and he had learned to trust those instincts. The police would be notified automatically, but it would take them at least 5 minutes to arrive. Whatever was going to happen in that parking garage would be over long before help could arrive. Maya Chen stood perfectly still as the 2 men approached, her breathing steady and her mind clear. She had hoped this day would never come, but Dr. Hayes had prepared her for it nonetheless. The men thought they had chosen their victim carefully, but they had made the most dangerous mistake possible. They had picked someone who was more dangerous than they could imagine, someone who had been trained to handle exactly this situation with lethal precision. The fluorescent lights continued to flicker overhead as Jake and Tommy closed the final distance to their target. In a few seconds, they would learn that some prey is more dangerous than any predator, and that sometimes the smallest person in the room is the one everyone else should fear. Jake Morrison reached Maya first, his confident smile never wavering as he stepped into what he assumed was striking distance. At 6'2" and over 200 pounds, he had never encountered a physical confrontation he couldn't handle through intimidation or brute force. His hand moved toward the knife in his jacket pocket, more for psychological effect than actual necessity. In his experience, most civilians folded the moment they realized they were facing someone with military training. "We're going to need you to come with us," Jake said, his voice dropping to a lower, more menacing tone. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Maya remained perfectly still, her dark eyes moving between Jake and Tommy with the calm assessment of someone evaluating a complex problem. To the approaching men, her stillness looked like fear-induced paralysis. They had no way of knowing that Maya was actually calculating distances, angles, and the precise sequence of movements that would neutralize both threats with minimal risk to herself. Tommy Valdez positioned himself behind and to the left of Maya's car, blocking her most obvious escape route. His compact frame and quick reflexes had made him valuable during urban combat operations, and he moved with the fluid precision of someone who had spent years perfecting close-quarters tactics. The weighted sap in his hand was designed to incapacitate without permanent injury. At least, that had been the intention when it was used against enemy combatants. Against a civilian target, Tommy wasn't particularly concerned about long-term consequences. What neither man realized was that Maya had already identified both of their weapons, assessed their tactical positioning, and formulated a response that would render their military training completely irrelevant. Dr. Hayes had taught her that conventional military combat techniques were designed for warfare between similarly trained opponents. Against someone who operated outside those parameters, traditional tactics became predictable and exploitable. Marcus Williams watched the confrontation unfold on his security monitors, his finger hovering over the emergency alert button. The body language of all 3 people in the parking garage told him everything he needed to know. This was about to become violent. His SEAL training screamed at him to intervene directly, but building policy required him to remain in the security office unless there was an immediate threat to the building itself. The best he could do was ensure the police were notified and try to provide real-time information to first responders. Jake took another step closer to Maya, now less than arm's length away. His confidence was absolute. He outweighed her by at least 80 pounds and had years of combat experience. Even if she tried to run, Tommy would cut her off. Even if she tried to fight, her small frame and obvious lack of training made resistance pointless. This was going to be simple. "Look, lady," Jake continued, his tone becoming more aggressive as he misinterpreted Maya's stillness as submission. "We don't want to hurt you, but we will if we have to. Just hand over your purse and car keys, and this will be over quick." Maya's response was so sudden and precise that Jake's brain couldn't process what was happening until it was already over. Her left hand moved in a blur, striking a pressure point just below Jake's right ear with surgical accuracy. The technique, called the neural shutdown by Dr. Hayes, interrupted the electrical signals between Jake's brain and nervous system for exactly 2.3 seconds, long enough for Maya to complete her follow-up movements. As Jake's body began to collapse, Maya's right elbow drove into his solar plexus with the focused force of a sledgehammer. The impact compressed his diaphragm and sent shockwaves through his entire respiratory system, making it impossible for him to breathe for the next 30 seconds. Simultaneously, Maya's knee rose to meet Jake's descending face, the collision producing a wet cracking sound as his nose broke and several teeth loosened. Jake Morrison, former Navy SEAL and veteran of multiple combat deployments, hit the concrete floor of the parking garage unconscious before his brain could register that he was under attack. The entire sequence had taken less than 2 seconds. Tommy Valdez watched his friend collapse with the stunned disbelief of someone witnessing something impossible. His military training told him to react immediately, to close distance and neutralize the threat before it could strike again. But his civilian experience suggested that what he had just seen couldn't actually have happened. Small women didn't drop Navy SEALs with their bare hands. There had to be some explanation. Jake must have slipped, or had a medical episode, or been drugged somehow. The momentary hesitation cost Tommy any chance he might have had. Maya turned toward him with the fluid grace of a dancer, her movements so perfectly controlled that she seemed to be floating rather than walking. Her expression remained completely calm, as if dropping a 200-pound man had required no more effort than swatting a fly. "Your friend made a poor choice," Maya said quietly, her voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing the weather. "You have approximately 3 seconds to make a better one." Tommy's training finally overrode his shock, and he lunged forward with the weighted sap raised above his head. His approach was textbook military doctrine: use superior reach and weapon advantage to overwhelm the opponent before they could respond. Against a normal civilian, the tactic would have been devastatingly effective. Maya sidestepped Tommy's attack with minimal movement, her body rotating just enough to let the weapon pass harmlessly by her head. As Tommy's momentum carried him past her, Maya's hand shot out to grab his wrist with a grip that felt like steel cables tightening around his bones. Her other hand found a nerve cluster at the base of his neck, applying pressure that sent waves of paralyzing pain through his entire upper body. Tommy tried to pull away but discovered that his arm was completely immobilized by Maya's grip. He attempted to strike her with his free hand, but the nerve pressure she was applying made coordinated movement impossible. His military training had taught him dozens of escape techniques for exactly this situation, but none of them seemed to work against someone who understood anatomy at the level Maya did. Maya's next movement was a thing of terrible beauty. She shifted her weight and used Tommy's own momentum to send him spinning through the air in a perfect arc. His body rotated twice before slamming into the concrete pillar behind Maya's car, with a sound like a bag of wet cement hitting a wall. Tommy slid down the pillar and crumpled to the ground, conscious, but unable to move anything below his shoulders. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 10 seconds. 2 former Navy SEALs, men who had been trained to handle the most dangerous combat situations in the world, lay defeated in a parking garage by a woman who hadn't even worked up a sweat. Marcus Williams stared at his monitors in complete disbelief. He had watched the entire encounter, but his brain was struggling to process what his eyes had seen. The woman had moved with a precision and efficiency that made his own military training look clumsy by comparison. He had seen special operations soldiers in action, had worked alongside the most elite warriors in the American military, but he had never witnessed anything like what had just happened in the parking garage below. His finger finally found the emergency button, though he realized that calling the police might no longer be necessary. The 2 men who had approached the woman were clearly no longer a threat to anyone. If anything, they were the ones who now needed help. Maya stood between the 2 fallen men, her breathing still perfectly steady, and her clothes completely unruffled. She looked down at Jake, who was beginning to regain consciousness but was still struggling to understand why his face hurt so badly. Tommy remained propped against the concrete pillar, his eyes wide with shock, and his body refusing to respond to his mental commands. The silence in the parking garage was broken only by Jake's labored breathing and the distant hum of building ventilation systems. Maya reached into her purse and withdrew her cell phone, her movements still deliberate and controlled. She could call 911 and report an attempted robbery, but that would require explaining her unusual skill set to police officers, who wouldn't understand how a consulting firm employee had neutralized 2 trained military personnel. Jake finally managed to focus his eyes and look up at Maya, his face a mask of blood and confusion. Through broken teeth and swollen lips he tried to speak. "What? What are you?" Maya knelt down beside him, her expression showing neither anger nor satisfaction. Only the calm professionalism of someone who had completed a necessary task. I'm someone who was taught to defend herself, she said simply. Your mistake was assuming that training and size always determine the outcome of a fight. Tommy found his voice from his position against the pillar, though speaking required tremendous effort. That wasn't normal fighting. That was something else entirely. Maya stood and looked down at both men with something that might have been pity. You're right. It wasn't normal fighting. Normal fighting is messy and unpredictable and dangerous for everyone involved. What I learned was how to end fights before they actually begin. She walked over to Tommy and crouched down beside him, her voice becoming more gentle. The paralysis is temporary. You should regain full movement within the next hour, though you're probably going to have a massive headache for the next few days. The damage to your friend is more serious but not permanent. He'll need medical attention for his nose and possibly dental work. Jake tried to sit up, but discovered that his entire body felt like it had been hit by a truck. Every breath sent waves of pain through his chest, and his face throbbed with each heartbeat. Through the haze of pain and confusion, one thought kept repeating in his mind: this wasn't possible. Women like this didn't exist in the real world. Maya returned to her car and retrieved a small first aid kit from the glove compartment. She had been taught to always carry medical supplies, both for her own potential injuries and for the injuries she might inflict on others. Dr. Diacronco captured. Hayes had emphasized that true martial artists took responsibility for the consequences of their actions, even when those actions were justified self-defense. As she cleaned Jake's facial wounds with antiseptic wipes, Maya spoke in the same calm, professional tone she might use during a business meeting. I'm going to give you both some advice, and I suggest you take it seriously. Find other ways to solve your problems. Whatever led you to think that robbing strangers was a good idea, it's not going to end well for you if you keep following that path. Jake winced as Maya cleaned blood from his broken nose, but he found himself listening despite the pain. There was something about her voice, not threatening exactly, but carrying the absolute certainty of someone who knew exactly what she was talking about. You were soldiers once, Maya continued, applying a temporary bandage to Jake's nose. That means you understood discipline and honor and protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. Figure out how to be those men again, because the alternative is going to be much worse than what happened here tonight. Tommy watched from his position against the pillar, gradually regaining feeling in his arms and legs. The woman's words stung more than his physical injuries because they were true. He and Jake had let bitterness and entitlement turn them into the kind of people they had once sworn to fight against. Maya finished treating Jake's immediate injuries and stood up, brushing dust from her clothes. The entire encounter, from the initial confrontation to the medical treatment, had taken less than 15 minutes. To anyone who hadn't witnessed it directly, the scene would look like two men had suffered some kind of accident, while a good Samaritan provided first aid. The sound of approaching sirens finally broke the silence in the parking garage. Marcus Williams had called for emergency medical assistance, though he hadn't been entirely sure how to explain what he had witnessed. The official report would describe an attempted robbery that had been interrupted when the victims fought back and injured themselves in the process. Maya collected her first aid supplies and walked back to her car, her movements still showing the same controlled precision that had characterized everything she did that evening. She had hoped never to use Dr. Hayes' training in the real world, but she felt no regret about what had been necessary. As the first police car entered the parking garage, Maya Chen started her Honda Civic and drove calmly toward the exit. Behind her, Jake Morrison and Tommy Valdez were learning that some lessons could only be taught through direct experience, and that the most dangerous opponents were often the ones who looked least threatening. Detective Sarah Martinez arrived at the Meridian office complex 22 minutes after the initial emergency call, her unmarked sedan joining the growing collection of police cruisers and ambulances in the parking garage.
At 35, Sarah had spent 12 years with the Seattle Police Department, the last 4 in the robbery-homicide division.
She had investigated hundreds of attempted muggings, but something about the initial reports from this scene didn't make sense. The paramedics were loading Jake Morrison into an ambulance as Sarah approached the crime scene. His injuries were extensive but not life-threatening. A broken nose, several loose teeth, severe bruising to his torso, and what appeared to be a mild concussion. Tommy Valdez was sitting in the back of a second ambulance, conscious and alert but complaining of temporary paralysis that was gradually wearing off. Officer Dave Chen, no relation to Maya despite the shared surname, briefed Detective Martinez as she surveyed the scene. Dave had been first to respond and had taken initial statements from both victims, though their stories were confusing and contradictory.
Here's what we know for sure, Dave said, consulting his notes.
Both suspects are former military, Navy SEALs according to their IDs. They claim they were attempting to rob a woman in the parking garage when she somehow fought back and injured both of them. Sarah raised an eyebrow. A woman fought back against 2 Navy SEALs? What kind of woman are we talking about here? Dave shrugged. That's where it gets weird. They describe her as small, Asian, maybe 5'4" and 120 pounds soaking wet. Says she was wearing business clothes and driving a Honda Civic. According to their story, she dropped them both in about 10 seconds using some kind of martial arts they'd never seen before. Sarah walked over to examine the physical evidence. Jake's blood was splattered across several square feet of concrete, and there were clear impact marks on the pillar where Tommy had apparently been thrown. The positioning and angle of the blood spatter suggested that Jake had been hit with tremendous force from multiple directions in rapid succession. Tommy Valdez had recovered enough mobility to speak coherently, and Sarah approached him for his version of events. Despite his injuries and obvious embarrassment, Tommy was surprisingly forthcoming about what had happened. "Look, detective, I know how this sounds," Tommy began, his voice still shaky from the encounter. "Jake and we made some bad choices tonight. We were drinking, we were angry about our situations, and we decided to rob someone. It was wrong, and I'm not trying to excuse it." Sarah appreciated his honesty, even though it made her job more complicated. Most criminals spend considerable energy trying to minimize their culpability, but Tommy seemed genuinely shaken by the evening's events. "Tell me about the woman," Sarah prompted. "What exactly did she do?" Tommy was quiet for a long moment, as if trying to organize his thoughts. "It wasn't fighting, not like anything I learned in the military. It was more like she was a surgeon, and we were patients on an operating table. Every movement was precise, efficient, surgical. She knew exactly where to hit and how much force to use." Sarah had seen plenty of self-defense situations during her career, but the physical evidence at the scene suggested something far beyond ordinary civilian training. The way Jake had been taken down required knowledge of anatomy and pressure points that most people simply didn't possess. The technique used on Tommy suggested someone with advanced understanding of biomechanics and nerve manipulation. Marcus Williams descended from the security office to provide his eyewitness account, and his testimony only deepened the mystery. As a former SEAL himself, Marcus had training that allowed him to better understand what he had witnessed, but that understanding only made the situation more confusing. "Detective, I watched the whole thing on the security cameras," Marcus explained. "I've seen special operations soldiers in action. I've trained with some of the best fighters in the world, and I've never seen anything like what that woman did. She moved with a precision that made military combat training look amateur." Sarah requested copies of the security footage, though Marcus warned her that the camera angles might not capture all the details of the confrontation. The parking garage had decent coverage, but the actual fight had happened in a spot where multiple camera views were partially blocked by concrete pillars. As the ambulances departed with Jake and Tommy, Sarah began processing the scene with a growing sense that this case was going to be unlike anything she had handled before. The physical evidence was clear. 2 large, trained men had been decisively defeated by a significantly smaller opponent using techniques that suggested professional-level martial arts training. The challenge was identifying the woman who had defended herself. Tommy and Jake could provide only a general description, and without a clear view from the security cameras, Sarah had little to work with. The Honda Civic had been captured on camera leaving the parking garage, but the license plate wasn't clearly visible in the available footage. Sarah spent the next hour interviewing building security and checking with nearby businesses to see if anyone else had witnessed the incident. The Meridian office complex housed several dozen companies, and she began making a list of employees who might match the general description provided by Tommy and Jake. Maya Chen, meanwhile, had driven home to her small apartment in the Capitol Hill neighborhood, her mind processing the events of the evening with the same methodical approach she applied to everything in her life. She had handled the situation exactly as Dr. Hayes had taught her: use minimal force to neutralize the threat, provide basic medical attention to prevent unnecessary suffering, and avoid drawing attention to her unusual capabilities. The apartment reflected Maya's personality: clean, organized, and functional without being sterile. Books on business strategy and project management filled one bookshelf, while another contained volumes on philosophy, psychology, and Eastern martial arts. A casual observer would see the home of a successful young professional. Only someone who knew what to look for would notice the subtle indicators of Maya's true capabilities. Maya showered and changed clothes, her movements still showing the same controlled precision that had characterized her actions in the parking garage. She felt no particular satisfaction about what had happened, but neither did she feel guilt or regret. Jake and Tommy had made choices that led to confrontation, and she had responded appropriately to protect herself. As she prepared for bed, Maya's phone rang. The caller ID showed Dr. Elizabeth Hayes, and Maya felt a flutter of concern. Dr. Hayes rarely contacted her former students without good reason, and a call this late at night suggested something important. Maya, I need to see you, Dr. Fry, Hayes said without preamble. Something happened tonight that we need to discuss. Maya had learned never to question Dr. Fire, Hayes' sources of information, or her seemingly supernatural awareness of events. During their training together, Dr. Hayes had often demonstrated knowledge of situations that should have been impossible for her to know about. Where would you like to meet? Maya asked. My office tomorrow evening at 8, and Maya, bring your go bag. The line went dead, and Maya stared at her phone with growing unease. The go bag was something Dr. Hayes had insisted all her students maintain. A small suitcase containing cash, false identification documents, and basic supplies that could support extended travel on short notice. Maya had hoped never to need it, but Dr. Hayes' tone suggested that hope might have been optimistic. Detective Martinez returned to the police station at 2:30 a.m. with more questions than answers. The physical evidence clearly supported the suspect's story about being defeated by a single woman, but the nature of that defeat suggested capabilities that went far beyond normal self-defense training. Sarah began running database searches for women in the Seattle area with advanced martial arts backgrounds. She checked with local dojos, martial arts schools, and self-defense instructors, looking for someone who might have the skills necessary to defeat two trained military personnel. The searches yielded dozens of potential matches, but most could be eliminated based on age, physical description, or training background. Several women had black belts in various martial arts, but the techniques described by Tommy and Marcus suggested something more sophisticated than traditional karate or kung fu. Sarah's partner, Detective Mike Rodriguez, arrived early the next morning to find her still working at her computer, surrounded by empty coffee cups and printouts from various databases. Rough night? Mike asked, settling into his desk chair with his own cup of coffee. Sarah briefed him on the parking garage incident, watching his expression grow more skeptical with each detail. Mike had 20 years of experience with the Seattle PD, and he had seen enough unusual cases to know that the truth was often stranger than fiction. So we're looking for a ninja, Mike said with a slight smile. A 5'4" Asian ninja who drives a Honda Civic and works late at an office building. That's about the size of it, Sarah replied. The physical evidence supports the story, and we have multiple witnesses including an ex-SEAL security guard. Whatever this woman's background, she has training that goes way beyond what most people would consider normal. Mike reviewed the case file and the security footage, his expression becoming more serious as he absorbed the details. The precision of the woman's movements and the efficiency with which she had neutralized both attackers suggested professional-level training. You know what this reminds me of? Mike said thoughtfully. Remember that case about 5 years ago? The one involving the arms dealer who got taken down by a single operative? The FBI classified most of the details, but the physical evidence suggested someone with exactly this kind of training. Sarah had heard rumors about that case, though the official reports had been heavily redacted. The incident had involved an international arms trafficking ring and had required intervention by federal agencies that didn't officially exist. You think our Honda Civic Ninja might be some kind of government agent? Sarah asked. Mike shrugged. Or ex-government. There are programs that train people to do exactly what we saw in that parking garage. The question is whether this woman is still active or if she's moved on to civilian life and just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The possibility that Maya might be a former government operative opened up entirely new dimensions to the case. If she was still active, investigating her could bring unwanted attention from federal agencies. If she was inactive, she might be trying to maintain a normal civilian life and would want to avoid any publicity about her unusual capabilities. Sarah decided to continue her investigation carefully, focusing on identifying the woman without immediately approaching her. If Maya was indeed a former government operative, she would have resources and skills that could make a direct confrontation extremely complicated. Maya spent the next day at her consulting firm, maintaining her normal routine while processing the implications of Dr. Hayes' late-night phone call. Her work involved analyzing business processes and recommending efficiency improvements, tasks that required the same methodical thinking she applied to everything else in her life. Her colleagues noticed nothing unusual about her behavior, though Maya was aware that she was being more careful than usual about maintaining her civilian persona. The events in the parking garage had reminded her how thin the line was between her normal life and the world Dr. Hayes had trained her for. As evening approached, Maya prepared to meet with her former mentor. Dr. Hayes had been both teacher and surrogate mother during the years of Maya's training, and her approval had become one of the most important things in Maya's life. If Dr. Hayes was concerned about the previous night's incident, there were probably implications that Maya hadn't yet considered. The go-bag sat by Maya's front door, packed and ready for whatever Dr. Hayes might require. Maya had no idea where the evening might lead, but she had learned to trust her mentor's judgment absolutely. If Dr. Hayes believed that Maya's normal life was in danger, then it probably was. Detective Martinez continued her investigation, gradually narrowing down the list of potential suspects. The woman she was looking for had to be someone with access to the Meridian Office complex, professional-level martial arts training, and the kind of background that would explain her unusual capabilities. As the day progressed, Sarah became more convinced that she was dealing with someone who had received training from government agencies or private military contractors. The precision of the techniques used against Jake and Tommy suggested someone who had been taught not just how to fight, but how to end fights with surgical efficiency. The question was whether identifying this woman would solve the case or only create new complications. If Maya was a former operative trying to live a normal civilian life, Sarah's investigation could expose her to enemies she had made during her previous career. If Maya was still active in covert operations, investigating her could bring attention from agencies that preferred to operate in the shadows. Either way, Sarah knew she was walking into a situation that was far more complex than a simple self-defense incident in a parking garage. Dr. Elizabeth Hayes operated her consulting firm from a nondescript office building in the Georgetown neighborhood, where the high-tech security systems and reinforced construction were disguised behind the facade of a typical small business. Maya arrived at exactly 8 p.m., her go-bag in hand and her mind prepared for whatever revelations the evening might bring. The waiting area looked like any other professional services office, with comfortable furniture, business magazines, and abstract artwork that revealed nothing about the true nature of Dr. Hayes' work. Maya had learned years ago that the most dangerous organizations were often the ones that looked most ordinary from the outside. Hayes appeared in the doorway to her private office, and Maya felt the familiar combination of respect and slight intimidation that her former mentor always inspired. At 62, Dr. Hayes maintained the bearing and physical condition of someone 20 years younger, her silver hair and conservative business attire concealing capabilities that would have impressed even elite military units. "Come in, Maya," Dr. Hayes said, her voice carrying the same calm authority that had guided Maya through years of intensive training. "We have a great deal to discuss." The private office revealed more about Dr. Hayes' true background, with military commendations, government citations, and photographs with high-ranking officials that most people would never recognize. Maya took her usual seat across from Dr. Hayes' desk, placing the go-bag on the floor beside her chair. "Tell me about last night," Dr. Hayes began, though Maya suspected her mentor already knew most of the details. Maya provided a complete account of the parking garage incident, describing the confrontation with Jake and Tommy in the same methodical detail she had been trained to use for after-action reports. Dr. Hayes listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. "You handled the situation correctly, Dr. Korb," Hayes said when Maya finished her account. "Minimal force, appropriate medical care, and no unnecessary attention. However, there are complications you're not aware of." Dr. Hayes opened a file folder and withdrew several photographs, spreading them across her desk where Maya could see them clearly. The images showed Jake Morrison and Tommy Valdez in military uniform, along with what appeared to be surveillance photographs taken during their discharge proceedings. Jake Morrison and Tommy Valdez were not randomly selected targets for dismissal from the Navy SEALs, Dr. Hayes explained. Their discharge was part of a larger investigation into unauthorized operations and human trafficking. Both men have connections to criminal organizations that extend far beyond simple robbery. Maya felt a chill as she absorbed this information. Her confrontation in the parking garage had not been a random encounter with desperate ex-soldiers, but rather contact with individuals who were connected to the kind of criminal networks her training had been designed to combat. "There's more," Dr. Hayes continued, withdrawing additional documents from the file. "The Seattle Police Department has assigned Detective Sarah Martinez to investigate last night's incident. Detective Martinez is competent and persistent, and she's beginning to ask the right questions about your background and capabilities." Maya had hoped to avoid any official attention, but she recognized that her unusual skill set made complete anonymity difficult to maintain. The techniques she had used against Jake and Tommy were distinctive enough to attract notice from anyone who understood advanced combat training. Dr. Hayes stood and walked to the window, her silhouette outlined against the Seattle skyline. "Maya, There's something I never told you about your training. You weren't selected randomly to participate in our program. You were identified specifically because of your potential to handle situations exactly like the one you encountered last night. The revelation hit Maya like a physical blow. She had believed that Dr. Hayes had accepted her as a student based on demonstrated aptitude and commitment, not because she had been targeted for recruitment by some larger organization. "What are you saying?" Maya asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Hayes turned back to face her, her expression showing both compassion and resolve. "You were recruited to be part of an unofficial network of individuals who could respond to threats that fall outside normal law enforcement capabilities. The training I provided was preparation for exactly the kind of criminal organizations that Jake Morrison and Tommy Valdez represent." Maya's mind raced as she processed the implications. Her normal civilian life, her job at the consulting firm, even her apartment, all of it had been built on the foundation of a lie. She wasn't simply someone who had learned self-defense. She was a covert operative who had been placed in Seattle for reasons she was only beginning to understand. "What happens now?" Maya asked, surprised by how steady her voice sounded despite the emotional turmoil she was experiencing. Dr. Hayes returned to her desk and opened another file, this one containing what appeared to be airline tickets, hotel reservations, and various identification documents. Jake Morrison and Tommy Valdez were attempting to recruit new assets for their criminal organization. Their approach to you last night was not random. They had identified you as someone who might be useful to their operations. The idea that she had been specifically targeted made Maya reconsider everything about the encounter. Jake and Tommy hadn't simply chosen her because she looked vulnerable. They had approached her because someone had marked her as a potential asset for criminal activities. "How did they know about me?" Maya asked. "That's what we need to find out," Dr. Hayes replied. "And why you need to disappear from Seattle immediately. If Jake and Tommy were working from intelligence about your background, their employers know that their recruitment attempt failed catastrophically. They'll want to understand what went wrong, and that means they'll be looking for you." Maya felt the walls of her carefully constructed civilian life crumbling around her. The apartment, the job, the normal existence she had built over the past 3 years, all of it would have to be abandoned because of a 10-second confrontation in a parking garage. "There's a flight to Portland leaving at 11:30 tonight," Dr. Hayes continued, sliding the travel documents across her desk. "From there, you'll connect to Los Angeles, then to Bangkok. I have a safe house arranged where you can stay until we determine the extent of the threat." Maya picked up the airline ticket and examined the name printed on it, Lisa Wong, an identity she had never seen before, but which apparently belonged to her nonetheless. The efficiency with which Dr. Hayes had arranged her extraction suggested planning and resources that went far beyond what most private consultants possessed. "How long have you been planning this?" Maya asked. Dr. Hayes smiled sadly. "Since the day I began training you." "Maya, the world is full of threats that governments can't officially acknowledge and law enforcement can't legally address. People like you exist to handle those threats, but that existence requires sacrifices that most people never have to consider." The weight of her situation settled over Maya like a heavy blanket. She had spent years learning to be dangerous, but she had never fully understood the price that danger would exact from her personal life. Detective Sarah Martinez, meanwhile, was working late at the Seattle Police Department, following leads that were gradually pointing toward Maya Chen as the woman who had defeated Jake Morrison and Tommy Valdez. Her investigation had identified several women who worked in the Meridian office complex and matched the general physical description. But Maya's background showed elements that didn't quite fit the pattern of a normal civilian. Maya's employment history was clean but unremarkable. Her credit report showed no red flags, and her rental history indicated a quiet, responsible tenant. However, several small details suggested a background that had been carefully constructed rather than naturally developed. Sarah had learned to recognize the signs of manufactured identities during her years investigating organized crime. Maya's background was too perfect, too consistent, and too free of the minor complications and inconsistencies that characterized real people's lives. More troubling was Maya's apparent lack of digital footprint prior to 3 years ago. Her social media presence was minimal, her online activity was practically non-existent, and there were no photographs or references to her from before she had arrived in Seattle. Sarah's partner Mike Rodriguez had spent the day following up on Maya's employment at the consulting firm, and his findings only deepened the mystery. Maya's colleagues described her as competent and professional, but none of them knew much about her personal life or background. It's like she materialized 3 years ago and has been living a perfectly normal but completely anonymous existence ever since. Mike reported, either she's the most boring person in Seattle, or she's working very hard to appear boring. Sarah was beginning to suspect the latter. Maya's combination of advanced combat skills and carefully maintained anonymity suggested someone who was either running from something or was part of something that required operational security. The question was whether Maya was a criminal hiding from law enforcement, a victim hiding from criminals, or something else entirely. Her actions in the parking garage suggested someone who was accustomed to violence but used it with precision and restraint, characteristics that pointed more toward professional training than criminal activity. Sarah decided to approach Maya's apartment building for surveillance, hoping to observe her behavior and potentially make contact. If Maya was indeed a former government operative, she might be willing to cooperate with law enforcement. If she was something else, surveillance might provide clues about her true background and intentions. Maya finished packing her go bag while Dr. Bravery Hayes made final arrangements for her extraction. The small suitcase contained everything she needed to survive for several weeks while maintaining multiple false identities, cash in different currencies, identity documents for 3 different personas, basic electronics, and clothing that would allow her to blend into various environments. What about Detective Martinez's investigation? Maya asked as she prepared to leave Dr. Hayes' office. Detective Martinez is good at her job, which makes her dangerous to you but potentially useful to us, Dr. Hayes replied. If we're lucky, her investigation will uncover information about Jake and Tommy's criminal connections that we can use to identify their employers. Maya felt a pang of regret about leaving Detective Martinez to investigate what would essentially become a cold case. The detective was simply doing her job, but Maya's disappearance would make that job much more difficult. What if I stayed and tried to cooperate with the police investigation? Maya suggested. Maybe I could help them understand what they're dealing with. Doctor. Hayes shook her head firmly. Maya, the organizations that Jake and Tommy represent operate at levels that local law enforcement can't handle. Detective Martinez is competent, but she lacks the resources and authority to protect you from the kind of retaliation you'll face if you remain in Seattle. The logic was inescapable. Even though Maya hated the necessity of abandoning her carefully constructed civilian life, she had grown attached to her apartment, her job, and the sense of normalcy she had managed to achieve during her 3 years in Seattle. As Maya prepared to leave for the airport, Dr. Hayes handed her a secure cell phone and a thick envelope containing additional cash and documents. Stay in contact, but assume all communications are monitored. I'll work on identifying Jake and Tommy's employers and determining when it might be safe for you to return. Maya took the phone and envelope, understanding that she was crossing a threshold from which there might be no return. The civilian life she had built was ending, and whatever came next would be determined by forces beyond her control. Hayes, Maya said as she reached the office door. Was any of it real? The job? The apartment? The normal life? Her mentor's expression softened slightly. The person you became during those 3 years was real, Maya. That's who you truly are when you're free to choose. Remember that, because it's what you're fighting to protect. Maya nodded and walked toward the elevator, her go bag containing everything she owned that mattered, and her future reduced to an airline ticket to Portland. Behind her, Dr. Hayes was already making phone calls to activate resources that would help track the criminal organization that had targeted Maya. Detective Sarah Martinez arrived at Maya's apartment building at 9:15 p.m., just as Maya was leaving through the building's rear exit with her go bag. The timing was purely coincidental, but it meant that Sarah's investigation had come within minutes of making contact with the woman she was seeking. Sarah established surveillance outside the building, unaware that her target was already gone and unlikely to return. The apartment Maya was leaving behind contained no clues about her true background or destination, only the remnants of a carefully constructed civilian identity that was now being abandoned forever. 3 weeks after Maya's disappearance from Seattle, Detective Sarah Martinez sat in her office reviewing a case file that had grown frustratingly complex. What had begun as a simple assault investigation had evolved into something that touched on international criminal organizations, covert government operations, and questions about the true nature of the woman who had vanished without a trace. Maya Chen's apartment had been empty when Sarah finally obtained a warrant to search it. The space was clean, organized, and completely devoid of personal items that might provide clues about her background or destination. Even more troubling, Maya had apparently never returned to her job at the consulting firm after the night of the parking garage incident. It's like she was a ghost, Sarah told her partner Mike Rodriguez as they reviewed the evidence. 3 years of what appeared to be a normal civilian life, and then she just evaporated the moment things got complicated. Mike had been pursuing the criminal connections of Jake Morrison and Tommy Valdez, and his findings painted a picture of an organization that operated at levels far beyond ordinary street crime. Both men had been discharged from the Navy SEALs as part of an investigation into unauthorized operations that involved human trafficking, arms dealing, and connections to international criminal syndicates. "The FBI is interested in our case now," Mike reported. Apparently, Jake and Tommy were small fish in a much larger operation, and their attempt to recruit Maya was part of something bigger than we initially understood. Sarah had been contacted by FBI Special Agent David Park, who had flown to Seattle specifically to discuss the parking garage incident. Agent Park's questions had focused less on Maya's identity and more on the techniques she had used to defeat Jake and Tommy, suggesting that the federal government had its own theories about her background. "Agent Park thinks Maya might be a former government operative," Sarah said. "Someone who was trained for covert operations but has been trying to live a civilian life." The possibility explained many of the inconsistencies in Maya's background and the extraordinary skills she had demonstrated during the confrontation. If Maya was indeed a former operative, her disappearance might have been orchestrated by the same organization that had originally trained her. Maya, meanwhile, was learning to adapt to life in a secure compound outside Bangkok, Thailand. The facility was officially a private security training center, but Maya quickly realized it served as a safe house for operatives who needed to disappear from their previous lives. The compound housed a dozen other individuals, each with their own reasons for needing to maintain low profiles while their handlers worked to resolve various threats and complications. Maya's roommate was a former CIA analyst named Jennifer Walsh, who had been extracted from Prague after discovering evidence of corruption within her own agency. "The hardest part isn't the isolation or the uncertainty," Jennifer explained during one of their evening walks around the compound's perimeter. "It's knowing that the life you built, the person you became, was always temporary. We're all just playing roles until someone decides we need to play different ones." Maya found comfort in talking with someone who understood the unique challenges of covert life, but she also felt a growing determination to reclaim some measure of control over her own destiny. The normal civilian existence she had built in Seattle might have been constructed on false foundations, but the person she had become during those 3 years felt genuine. Dr. Elizabeth Hayes visited the compound 6 weeks after Maya's extraction, bringing updates on the investigation into the criminal organization that had targeted her. The news was both encouraging and troubling. "We've identified the leadership structure of the organization that employed Jake Morrison and Tommy Valdez," Dr. Hayes reported during a private meeting in the compound's secure conference room. "They're part of a network that specializes in recruiting individuals with military or intelligence backgrounds for criminal operations. The criminal organization, known internally as the Cerberus Group, operated by identifying former government operatives who were struggling with civilian life and recruiting them for activities that leverage their specialized skills. Maya's civilian identity had been compromised because someone within the organization had access to intelligence databases that should have been classified." "How did they know about me?" Maya asked, though she suspected the answer would be disturbing. Dr. Hayes opened a file containing photographs and documents that revealed the scope of the security breach. "Someone with access to our personnel records has been providing information to Cerberus. We're dealing with a mole who has been operating for at least 2 years." The revelation that someone within Dr. Hayes' organization was working with criminals added a new dimension to Maya's situation. She wasn't just hiding from external enemies, she was also vulnerable to betrayal from people who were supposed to protect her. "What does this mean for my future?" Maya asked. Dr. Hayes' expression was grave. "Until we identify and neutralize the mole, you can't return to any kind of normal civilian life. Cerberus will continue to hunt you as long as they believe you might be useful to their operations or dangerous to their security." Maya felt the weight of permanent exile settling over her like a shroud. The life she had built in Seattle was gone forever, and her future would be determined by the outcome of a shadow war she had never chosen to join. Back in Seattle, Detective Sarah Martinez was learning similar truths about the case that had consumed her professional life for the past 2 months. The FBI's involvement had brought resources and expertise, but it had also revealed how little local law enforcement could do about threats that operated at international levels. Agent Park had been surprisingly forthcoming about the broader implications of the case, though Sarah suspected he was sharing information strategically rather than out of simple transparency. "Maya Chen is almost certainly a former government operative who was trying to maintain a civilian identity," Agent Park explained during a briefing at the Seattle FBI field office. "Her extraction from Seattle was probably conducted by the same organization that originally trained her, which suggests she's part of a network that operates outside normal government channels. Sarah had hoped that federal involvement would lead to Maya's location and eventual return to Seattle for questioning. But Agent Park's priorities lay elsewhere.
Our primary interest is in the criminal organization that targeted Ms. Chen, Agent Park continued.
The Cerberus group represents a significant threat to national security, and her confrontation with their operatives has provided us with valuable intelligence about their recruitment methods. Sarah realized that Maya had become secondary to the larger investigation. The woman who had defended herself in a parking garage was now just another data point in a complex case involving international criminal enterprises and covert government operations. Jake Morrison and Tommy Valdez, meanwhile, were discovering that their failure to recruit Maya had consequences that extended far beyond their own legal troubles. Both men had been arrested and charged with attempted robbery, but their real problems lay with their former employers in the Cerberus group. Jake was recovering from his injuries in the King County Jail when he received a visit from a man who identified himself only as Mr. Paper Smith. The visitor's appearance was unremarkable, but Jake's military training allowed him to recognize the signs of someone who was far more dangerous than he appeared. "You were supposed to bring us a potential recruit," Mr. Smith said, his voice carrying the flat, emotionless tone that Jake associated with professional interrogators.
"Instead, you managed to expose our entire Seattle operation to federal investigation." Jake tried to explain that Maya's capabilities had been completely unexpected, but Mr. Smith showed no interest in excuses or explanations. The Cerberus group had invested considerable resources in identifying and approaching Maya, and the failure of that operation had cost them both money and operational security. "What happens now?" Jake asked, though he was afraid he already knew the answer.
Mr. Smith smiled, an expression that contained no warmth or humor.
"Now you and your partner become liabilities that need to be managed. The organization has methods for dealing with liabilities." Jake understood that he and Tommy were marked for elimination, though the timing and method would depend on factors beyond their control. Their knowledge of Cerberus operations made them dangerous witnesses, and their failure in Seattle had marked them as incompetent assets. Maya spent her days at the Bangkok compound training with other operatives and learning about the broader network of organizations that Dr. Hayes represented. The facility served as both safe house and training center, preparing operatives for assignments that ranged from corporate espionage to counterterrorism operations. The training was unlike anything Maya had experienced, even during her intensive work with Dr. Hayes. She learned about psychological warfare, advanced surveillance techniques, and methods for maintaining cover identities that could withstand investigation by hostile intelligence services. More importantly, she began to understand her place within a larger community of individuals who had chosen to operate outside normal legal and social structures in service of goals that couldn't be achieved through conventional means. "The work we do exists because governments can't always act officially to address certain threats," explained David Kim, a former Delta Force operator who served as one of the compound's training instructors. "We're not vigilantes or mercenaries. We're people who have accepted responsibility for protecting innocent people from dangers that most of the world doesn't even know exist." Maya found purpose in this mission, even as she grieved for the normal life she had lost. The civilian identity she had maintained in Seattle had been fulfilling, but it had also been built on the foundation of ignoring problems that only people with her capabilities could address. After 3 months in Bangkok, Dr. Hayes arrived with a new assignment and the promise that Maya could begin to reclaim some measure of control over her destiny. "The mole within our organization has been identified and neutralized," Dr. Hayes reported. "More importantly, we've located the leadership structure of the Cerberus group and have an opportunity to dismantle their operations permanently. The mission would require Maya to assume a new identity and infiltrate Cerberus operations in Eastern Europe, using her apparent vulnerability as bait to draw out the organization's key personnel. It was dangerous work that could result in capture or death, but it also offered the possibility of eliminating the threat that had forced her into exile." "What about my civilian life?" Maya asked. "Will I ever be able to go back to being a normal person?" Dr. Hayes considered the question carefully before answering. "Maya, the person you were in Seattle was always real, even if the circumstances were manufactured. When this mission is complete, you'll have the option to build a new civilian identity anywhere in the world. Whether you choose to do that or continue with covert operations will be entirely up to you." Maya accepted the assignment, understanding that it represented her best chance to close the chapter on her past and begin writing her own future. The normal life she had lost in Seattle could never be recovered, but she could build something new that incorporated both her civilian aspirations and her unique capabilities. Detective Sarah Martinez closed the Maya Chen case file 6 months after the parking garage incident, marking it as solved but sealed due to federal classification requirements. She never learned Maya's true identity or ultimate fate, but she understood that some stories extend far beyond the boundaries of local law enforcement. Maya Chen, meanwhile, was already operating under a new identity in Prague, tracking the financial networks that supported Cerberus operations and preparing to end the threat that had destroyed her previous life. She had learned that some battles could only be fought by people willing to live in the shadows, and she had accepted her role as someone who protected the world from dangers it would never know existed. The woman who had defended herself in a Seattle parking garage had become something larger and more dangerous, but she had also retained the essential humanity that made her fight worth winning. Maya Chen was gone forever, but the person she had truly been would continue to exist in whatever identity she chose to build next.